I remember the exact moment everything changed, though I didn't understand it then. The apartment was bathed in that familiar blue glow from the television screen, the kind of artificial twilight that had become our natural habitat during those long Friday nights. The controller felt warm in my hands, worn smooth from countless hours of use, my thumbs moving across the buttons with the practiced precision of someone who had found refuge in digital worlds. Ezra sat beside me on the couch, close enough that I could hear his breathing change when the action intensified, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body in the cramped living room. We had been playing for hours, lost in the rhythm of competition and camaraderie that had defined our friendship for the better part of 2 years. The sounds of gunfire and explosions filled the space between us, punctuated by our occasional commentary. The lazy banter of two people completely comfortable in each other's presence. I was focused, locked in that zone where nothing existed except the screen and my reactions to it. My character was pinned down behind cover, health bar flashing red, and I was calculating my next move when I heard it. The soft thud of plastic hitting the coffee table. Ezra had set down his controller. At first, I didn't look over. I assumed he was reaching for his drink, or maybe stretching his arms above his head the way he always did when a match got too intense. I expected him to pick up the controller again within seconds, maybe make some joke about how I was taking forever to make my move. I expected the familiar rhythm of our evening to continue uninterrupted. But the seconds stretched on, and he didn't move. Something in the quality of his stillness pulled at my attention, a gravity I couldn't ignore. I glanced sideways, expecting to see him scrolling through his phone or rubbing his eyes. Instead, I found him watching me. Not the screen. Me. The look on his face was nothing I had ever seen before, at least not directed at me. It was steady and unblinking, patient in a way that suggested he had been waiting for me to notice. There was something in his expression that made my chest tighten, something that felt too significant for our usual Friday night routine. His dark eyes held mine with an intensity that made the ongoing battle on the screen feel suddenly irrelevant. I felt my character die in my peripheral vision, the familiar sound of defeat echoing from the speakers, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from Ezra. My hand was still gripping the controller, but my fingers had gone slack on the buttons. The game was asking if I wanted to respawn, the prompt flashing insistently, but I was paralyzed by the weight of his gaze. There was something different in the air between us, a charge I had never noticed before or had spent months unconsciously ignoring. The space on the couch that separated us felt both too vast and too small. I could see every detail of his face in the flickering light. The slight stubble along his jaw, the way his lips were pressed together as if he was holding back words, the patient intensity in his eyes that suggested he was waiting for me to understand something that had been there all along. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the strange spell that had settled over us. I wanted to ask him why he was looking at me like that, why he had stopped playing, why my heart was suddenly beating so hard I was certain he could hear it. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself searching his face for clues, trying to decode the meaning behind his expression. The apartment around us felt smaller somehow, more intimate. The familiar clutter of our shared space, the empty pizza boxes and scattered textbooks, the mismatched furniture we had acquired through various means, all of it seemed to fade into the background. There was only the soft glow of the television, the distant hum of traffic outside our window, and this moment stretching between us like a hell breath. I became acutely aware of everything. The way his t-shirt clung to his shoulders, the sound of his breathing in the quiet room, the fact that his knee was just inches from mine on the cushion. Details I had somehow managed to overlook for months suddenly demanded my attention, as if I was seeing him clearly for the first time. The game was still running, my character's respawn timer counting down, but neither of us moved to pick up the controllers. I realized that I was afraid, though I couldn't have explained why. Afraid of what this look meant, afraid of the way it was making me feel, afraid of the possibility that everything I thought I knew about our friendship might be built on foundations I had never examined too closely. But more than that, I was afraid of looking away. Despite the terror creeping up my spine, despite the voice in my head insisting that I should laugh this off, make a joke, return to the safety of our game, I couldn't tear my gaze from his. Something about the openness in his expression, the vulnerability I had never seen him display, kept me anchored in place. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and possibilities I wasn't ready to name. I could feel the walls I had carefully built around certain thoughts beginning to crack, could feel the comfortable certainty of our friendship shifting into something I didn't understand. The look in his eyes was patient but unwavering, as if he was willing to wait as long as it took for me to catch up to wherever he was in this moment. I knew, even then, that whatever was happening between us would change everything. I knew that the safety of our routine, the ease of our friendship, the careful boundaries we had maintained, were all hanging in the balance of this single, wordless exchange. And despite every instinct telling me to retreat, to make a joke, to pretend I didn't see what was so clearly written across his face, I stayed frozen in place. Because somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the confusion and the panic, was a recognition I wasn't ready to acknowledge. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I had been waiting for this moment too, without ever admitting it to myself. The realization terrified me more than anything else, but I couldn't look away from the gentle certainty in his eyes, couldn't escape the feeling that he was seeing something in me that I had spent years trying to keep hidden. The game continued its digital symphony in the background, but we remained suspended in that moment, caught between what we had always been and what we might become. The moment passed, as all moments must, but its echo lingered in the apartment long after we returned to our game. Ezra picked up his controller with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I forced myself to focus on the respawn screen, my hands trembling slightly as I selected my loadout. We played for another hour, maybe two, but something fundamental had shifted in the space between us, invisible but undeniable. This was our world, this cramped two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. The carpet was a faded beige that showed every stain, the walls painted an optimistic yellow by some previous tenant who had long since moved on to better things. Our furniture told the story of two college students making do, a couch inherited from Ezra's older brother, its brown leather cracked and softened by years of use, a coffee table I had rescued from a curb on move-in day, its surface now permanently marked by water rings and controller scratches. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person, let alone two, with cabinets that didn't quite close properly and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly. Our dishes were mismatched, collected from thrift stores and borrowed from our respective childhood homes. Fast food containers accumulated on every available surface during our busiest weeks, testaments to our shared inability to maintain adult schedules while juggling classes and part-time jobs. But somehow this chaos felt like home in a way that surprised me. I had always been the organized one, the planner, the person who made lists and kept schedules. My side of the apartment reflected this. Textbooks arranged by subject, clothes folded and put away, a desk cleared of everything except the essentials needed for my engineering coursework. I approached my studies the same way I approached everything else, with careful precision and attention to detail. Ezra was my opposite in almost every way. His film equipment occupied whatever space it needed, tripods leaning against walls, cameras and lenses scattered across his desk in organized chaos only he could navigate. His side of the living room overflowed with movie posters, stacks of DVDs, notebooks filled with story ideas and screenplay fragments. He lived in bursts of creative energy, staying up until dawn working on projects, then sleeping until afternoon the next day. Our friendship had developed around these differences rather than despite them. I became the anchor that kept him grounded, reminding him about deadlines and making sure he ate actual meals instead of surviving on coffee and inspiration. He brought spontaneity into my carefully ordered world, dragging me away from my textbooks to see late-night screenings of obscure films, introducing me to music I would never have discovered on my own. Our Friday night gaming sessions had become sacred ritual. No matter what else was happening in our lives, No matter how overwhelming school became or how many shifts we had to pick up at our respective jobs, Friday nights belonged to us. We would order too much pizza, turn the music up loud enough to annoy the neighbors, and lose ourselves in whatever game had captured our attention that week. I had come to rely on these evenings more than I cared to admit. There was something comforting about the predictability of it, the easy companionship that required no analysis or explanation. We could sit together for hours without feeling the need to fill every silence with conversation. We could argue passionately about strategy or storylines without any real anger behind it. We had developed our own language of inside jokes and shared references, a shorthand that made us feel like we were part of something exclusive and understood. But now, remembering the way Ezra had looked at me just hours before, I wondered if I had been willfully blind to other currents running beneath the surface of our friendship. I found myself paying attention to details I had somehow overlooked. The way he always chose to sit on the same end of the couch as me rather than spreading out, how he would absently reach for my phone when his was charging across the room, the casual intimacy with which he would steal food from my plate without asking. There were other things too, smaller moments I had filed away without examining them too closely. The way his face would light up when I walked into a room, how he seemed to save his best stories for me, how he had gradually stopped dating other people without any explanation or fanfare. I had assumed it was because he was focused on his studies, or because he preferred the simplicity of our routine to the complications of romance. Now I wondered if there had been other explanations I had been too afraid to consider. The apartment felt different in the wake of that look, charged with possibilities I wasn't ready to name. Every familiar object seemed to hold new significance. The couch where we spent most of our time together, the kitchen where we prepared late-night snacks, the narrow hallway that led to our respective bedrooms. The space that had always felt comfortable now hummed with an energy that made me hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every moment when our paths crossed in the daily rhythm of shared living. I told myself I was overthinking things, reading meaning into a moment that had probably been nothing more than distraction or fatigue. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew something had changed. The ease that had always existed between us now carried an undercurrent of tension, as if we were both waiting for something to happen, some acknowledgement of what had passed between us in the blue glow of the television screen. This was our world, unremarkable and chaotic and completely ordinary. But I was beginning to suspect that ordinary might not be the right word for what we had built together in this small apartment. With its mismatched furniture and accumulated clutter, its late-night conversations and comfortable silences. I was beginning to suspect that what I had always called friendship might be something else entirely. The shift began small, so subtle, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. 3 days after that night, when Ezra set down his controller and looked at me like he was seeing something new, I caught him watching me again. This time I was standing at the kitchen counter, making coffee in the early morning quiet, and when I turned around, he was leaning against the doorframe, his hair still messy from sleep, studying me with that same patient intensity. "Good morning," I said, offering him the extra cup I had automatically prepared out of habit. He took it from my hands, his fingers brushing mine for just a moment longer than necessary. "Morning," he replied, but his voice was softer than usual, almost careful. That afternoon, while I was hunched over my differential equations homework, Ezra appeared beside the couch with 2 jackets in his hands. "Come on," he said, tossing mine across my textbooks. "We're going for a walk." I looked up from the problem I had been wrestling with for the better part of an hour. "Since when do you go for walks?" "Since today," he said, already pulling on his jacket. "The city looks different at sunset." Trust me, I wanted to protest, to point out that I had work to finish and that spontaneous walks were more his thing than mine. But something in his expression stopped me, the same quiet certainty I had seen in his eyes 3 nights before. I closed my textbook and followed him out into the cooling air. We wandered through the neighborhood without any particular destination, past the corner store where we bought our late-night snacks, past the bus stop where we waited together most mornings. The familiar streets looked different in the golden light of early evening, softer somehow, more forgiving. Ezra walked close beside me, close enough that our shoulders occasionally bumped as we navigated the uneven sidewalk. "Do you ever think about what happens after graduation?" he asked as we paused at a crosswalk, watching the traffic flow past in both directions. The question caught me off guard. I had always been so focused on getting through each semester, each assignment, each exam, that the future felt distant and abstract. Sometimes I admitted, "Why?" He shrugged, but there was something deliberate about his casualness. "Just wondering if you see yourself staying in the city, or if you'll move back home, get some corporate job in the suburbs." The light changed and we crossed, but his question lingered between us. I had never seriously considered staying after graduation, had always assumed I would follow the path of least resistance, take whatever job offer seemed most practical and sensible. But walking beside Ezra in the fading light, I found myself imagining alternatives I had never allowed myself to consider. The walks became a regular thing. Every few days, Ezra would appear with jackets or suggest we needed air, and I would find myself following him out into the city. We explored neighborhoods I had never bothered to visit, discovered coffee shops and bookstores tucked away on side streets, sat on park benches, and watched people pass by. Sometimes we talked about school or movies or plans for the weekend. Sometimes we walked in comfortable silence, the space between us charged with something I still couldn't name. During our gaming sessions, I began to notice other changes. Ezra would sit closer than before, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his leg against mine. When he got excited about a particularly good play or frustrated by a difficult boss, he would reach out and grab my arm, his hand lingering a moment longer each time before pulling away. When we shared headphones to listen to a new song he wanted to show me, he would lean in until our foreheads were almost touching, and I would find myself holding my breath until the song ended. One night, after we had been playing for hours, Ezra set down his controller and stretched, his arms reaching above his head in a way that pulled his shirt up slightly, revealing a strip of skin that made something twist in my chest. "I'm getting tired," he said, but instead of heading to his room the way he usually did, he settled back into the corner of the couch, pulling his legs up and creating a space that seemed to invite me to move closer. "I should go to bed too," I said, but I didn't move. Neither did he. We sat there in the blue glow of the television screen, the game forgotten, and I became acutely aware of every detail. The rise and fall of his breathing, the way his eyes reflected the flickering light, the fact that I could close the distance between us with the slightest movement. The apartment around us felt smaller, more intimate, as if the walls had moved closer while we weren't paying attention. "Do you ever wonder," Ezra said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "if this is it? If this feeling, this comfort we have together, if it's what people spend their whole lives looking for?" My heart began beating faster, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" He gestured around the messy living room, at the empty pizza box on the coffee table, at the controllers lying abandoned between us. Us, being completely comfortable with another person, never having to pretend to be someone else. I wanted to tell him I knew what he meant, that I had been wondering the same thing without realizing it. I wanted to acknowledge the shift I had been feeling, the way our friendship had begun to feel like something deeper and more significant than anything I had experienced before. But the words felt too dangerous, too loaded with implications I wasn't ready to face. "Yeah," I said instead, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "I think about that sometimes." He smiled then, small and knowing, and I realized that my careful neutrality had revealed more than I meant it to. The transformation crept through me like water through stone, slow and inevitable and impossible to reverse. I began noticing things about Ezra that I had somehow trained myself not to see, details that demanded attention with an urgency that left me breathless and confused. The way he chewed his lower lip when he was concentrating became a source of fascination I couldn't explain. I would find myself watching him during our gaming sessions, waiting for that small gesture, feeling something tighten in my chest when his teeth caught his lip just right. When he laughed, really laughed at something genuinely funny rather than just polite, his whole face would transform, and I discovered that I had been collecting these moments without realizing it, storing them away like precious things. One evening, as we sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through his collection of DVDs. Looking for something to watch after dinner, he reached across me to grab a case that had fallen behind the television stand. His arm brushed against mine, solid and warm, and I felt an electric shock of awareness that made my breath catch. He paused, looking at me with a question in his eyes, and I realized I was staring at the place where our skin had touched as if it held some kind of significance I couldn't decode. The boundaries of our friendship began to blur in ways that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Our conversations, which had always been easy and natural, took on new depths that left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. One night, as we walked through the quiet streets near campus, Ezra asked me about my childhood in a way that suggested he genuinely wanted to understand something essential about who I was. I found myself telling him things I had never shared with anyone. About the loneliness of being the practical one in a family of dreamers, about the pressure I felt to have everything figured out, about the fears that kept me awake at night when I thought too hard about the future. He listened with an attention that felt almost sacred, nodding at the right moments, asking questions that revealed he was really hearing what I was saying. In return, he began sharing pieces of himself I had never glimpsed before. He told me about growing up feeling different from his siblings, about the way he had learned to use humor and energy to deflect attention from the things that made him feel vulnerable. He talked about his dreams of making films that mattered, stories that could help people feel less alone in the world, and the fear that he might not be talented enough to achieve what he imagined. These conversations left me feeling closer to him than I had ever felt to another person, but they also created a restlessness I didn't know how to manage. I would lie awake in my room afterward, replaying his words, trying to understand why his trust felt like both a gift and a burden. The physical space between us continued to shrink. During our gaming sessions, we gradually migrated from our usual positions on opposite ends of the couch to sitting close enough that our thighs touched. When one of us got frustrated with a particularly difficult section, the other would automatically provide comfort through small touches. A hand on a shoulder, fingers briefly squeezing an arm, the casual intimacy of shared space. Ezra began changing his social patterns in ways that should have been obvious, but somehow surprised me. Friends would invite him out for drinks or parties, and he would decline, saying he had plans with me even when we hadn't made any specific arrangements. He stopped mentioning other people he might be interested in dating, stopped bringing up the casual hookups that had been part of his life throughout college. I told myself these changes didn't necessarily mean anything, that friends could be close without it implying something deeper. But late at night, when I was alone with my thoughts, I couldn't escape the growing certainty that something fundamental was shifting between us. One Friday evening, after we had been playing for hours, we found ourselves in one of those comfortable silences that had become more frequent. The controllers lay forgotten on the coffee table, and we were sitting close enough that I could feel Ezra's breathing, could smell the faint scent of his shampoo. The television cast its familiar blue glow across both our faces, but neither of us was watching the screen. I became aware that he was looking at me again, not with the sudden intensity of that first night, but with something softer and more patient. When I turned to meet his gaze, I saw something in his eyes that made my heart race and my stomach drop simultaneously. He said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient sound from the game, "I've been thinking about what I said the other night, about this being what people look for their whole lives." I waited, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "I think I was wrong," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't think this is what people look for. I think this is what they find when they stop looking and start paying attention to what's already there." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I felt something inside me crack, open, a wall I had built without realizing it beginning to crumble. Every instinct told me to make a joke, to deflect, to return to the safety of our established patterns. But the honesty in his expression held me in place, demanding a response I wasn't sure I was brave enough to give. Instead, I reached for his hand where it rested on his knee, my fingers trembling as they intertwined with his. The gesture felt both natural and terrifying, a small acknowledgement of something I still couldn't name, but could no longer deny. The storm arrived on a Tuesday night in late October, bringing with it the kind of rain that transforms the familiar world into something strange and electric. I had been at my desk, working through a thermodynamics problem set that seemed determined to defeat me, when the first rumble of thunder rolled across the city. Ezra was in his room, editing footage for a project that was due the following week, the soft glow of his computer screen visible beneath his door. The power went out just after midnight, plunging the apartment into sudden darkness. For a moment, neither of us moved, waiting to see if the electricity would flicker back on the way it sometimes did during summer storms. But the darkness held, complete and enveloping, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated our living room in stark, momentary detail. I heard Ezra's door open, heard his careful footsteps in the hallway as he navigated by memory and the intermittent lightning. I found him in the kitchen, opening and closing drawers by feel, searching for the candles we kept for emergencies like this. "Here," I said, reaching around him to open the correct drawer, my hand closing over the small collection of votive candles we had accumulated over the years. My chest pressed briefly against his back as I leaned past him, and I felt him go still at the contact. We lit 4 candles and arranged them around the living room, their warm glow creating intimate pools of light that made our familiar space feel transformed, almost sacred. The storm continued outside, rain drumming against the windows with increasing intensity, wind howling through the spaces between buildings. The city beyond our walls had disappeared, leaving only this small sanctuary of flickering light and shared presence. Without the television or our computers to distract us, we found ourselves sitting on the couch, closer than we might have chosen under normal circumstances, but perfectly natural in the candlelit intimacy of the moment. The storm seemed to demand a different kind of conversation, something more honest than our usual banter. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told him, my voice quieter than I intended, "about paying attention to what's already there." He turned to face me, his features soft and shadowed in the candlelight. "And what do you see when you pay attention?" The question hung between us, loaded with possibility and danger. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, a decision being made without my conscious participation. The safety I had always found in carefully chosen words and measured responses suddenly felt less important than the truth that was pressing against my chest, demanding acknowledgement. "I see you," I said finally, the words coming out raw and uncertain. "I see the way you look at me, like I'm something worth understanding. I see how you've been patient with me, even when I've been too afraid to understand what was happening between us." Thunder crashed overhead, so close it seemed to shake the building, but neither of us flinched. Ezra's eyes remained fixed on mine, encouraging me to continue. "I see that you stopped going out with friends because you wanted to be here with me. I see that you've been creating these moments, these opportunities for us to be closer, and I've been too scared to acknowledge what they meant." The candles flickered in a draft from somewhere, sending shadows dancing across the walls. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence that followed my admission, could feel the weight of words I had never allowed myself to think, let alone speak. "You know this isn't just games anymore, right?" Ezra said, his voice so low it was almost lost beneath the sound of rain against the windows. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. He reached out then, his hand covering mine where it rested on the couch between us. His fingers were warm and slightly trembling, betraying the nervousness he was trying to hide beneath his calm exterior. The simple contact sent electricity through my entire body, a current that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. "I've been wanting to tell you," he said, his thumb tracing gentle circles across my knuckles. "I've been wanting to be honest about what this feels like for me, but I didn't want to push you into something you weren't ready for." The candlelight caught the curve of his mouth as he spoke, and I found myself staring at his lips with an intensity that would have embarrassed me under any other circumstances. But in this moment, with the storm creating a pocket of privacy around us and his hand warm against mine, embarrassment felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. I leaned toward him, drawn by something stronger than conscious decision. He met me halfway, his free hand coming up to cup my cheek with a gentleness that made my eyes flutter closed. When our lips finally touched, it was with the careful reverence of something long anticipated and deeply feared. The kiss was tentative at first, both of us testing the boundaries of this new territory. But when I didn't pull away, when I instead pressed closer and let my hand find the back of his neck, he responded with a quiet sigh that seemed to release months of held breath. Everything I had been trying not to feel, all the awareness I had been pushing down and denying, rushed through me at once. This was what I had been afraid of acknowledging, not just attraction, but recognition. The sense that this person, this moment, this feeling was what I had been unconsciously moving toward for years without understanding my destination. When we finally broke apart, foreheads touching, breathing unsteady, I realized that the storm outside had become secondary to the one happening inside me. Thunder continued to roll across the city, but all I could focus on was the way Ezra was looking at me, with relief and joy and something deeper that I was finally ready to name. "I know," I whispered against his lips, answering his earlier question with a certainty that surprised us both. The morning after changed everything and nothing at all. I woke up in my own bed, in my own room, with sunlight streaming through the blinds and the familiar sounds of traffic resuming outside our windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind only puddles on the sidewalk and the clean smell of washed air. The power had returned sometime while we slept, the digital clocks blinking their confused zeros, the refrigerator humming back to life. But I could not shake the memory of candlelight on Ezra's face, could not forget the way his lips had felt against mine, or the certainty that had filled me in that moment of recognition. Now, in the harsh light of ordinary morning, that certainty felt dangerous and overwhelming. I heard him moving around in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of our morning routine continuing as if nothing fundamental had shifted between us. Coffee brewing, cabinets opening and closing, the soft clink of mug being set on the counter. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine walking out there, accepting the cup he would inevitably offer me, continuing our conversation from where the storm had interrupted it. Instead, I stayed in my room until I heard the front door close, until I was certain he had left for his morning classes. Only then did I emerge, moving through our shared space like a ghost haunting his own life. The evidence of the previous night was minimal but unmistakable. For small candles sat on the coffee table, wax pooled around their bases, the scent of vanilla still lingering in the air. The couch cushions were slightly disarranged from where we had sat so close together, where I had finally allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been feeling for months. I spent the day in a state of careful avoidance, timing my movements around his schedule, leaving for the library before he returned from classes, staying late at my part-time job even though there was no real need. I told myself I needed time to think, to process what had happened, to figure out what it meant for our friendship and our living situation and our carefully constructed routine. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. I was terrified. Terrified of what would happen if we tried to turn whatever this was into something real and substantial. Terrified of losing the easy companionship that had become the foundation of my life at college. Terrified of the possibility that what felt momentous and life-changing to me might be nothing more than an experiment for him. A curious detour from his usual patterns that he would eventually grow tired of. Most of all, I was terrified of myself, of the intensity of what I had felt in that moment when our lips touched. I had spent years building careful walls around certain thoughts and possibilities, had convinced myself that the attraction I occasionally felt toward men was nothing more than academic curiosity or confusion. The kiss had shattered those comfortable lies, had forced me to confront the reality that this was not confusion or experimentation, but recognition of something fundamental about who I was. Ezra, for his part, seemed to understand my need for space without taking it personally. He didn't push or demand explanations for my sudden absence from our usual routines. When we inevitably crossed paths in the apartment, he was gentle and patient, offering me the same warm smile he always had, asking about my day with genuine interest, giving no indication that he expected anything to have changed between us. But I caught him watching me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Not with the intensity of that first night, when everything shifted, but with a quiet hopefulness that made my chest ache. He was waiting, I realized, for me to decide what happened next. The waiting stretched on for days, then a week, then longer. I threw myself into my coursework with desperate focus, staying late in the engineering building, volunteering for extra shifts at work, anything to avoid the quiet moments when my thoughts would inevitably turn to the memory of his hand on my cheek, his breath warm against my skin. But avoidance could only last so long in the confined space of our shared apartment. Eventually, I would have to face him, would have to face the choice he had laid out for me in that moment of candlelit honesty. The decision finally came to me on a Thursday night, as I sat alone in my room, trying to focus on a problem set that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Through the thin walls, I could hear the soft sounds of Ezra moving around the apartment, the quiet rhythm of his evening routine continuing without me. I realized, with a clarity that cut through weeks of confusion and fear, that I had already lost the thing I was most afraid of losing. By pulling away, by refusing to acknowledge what had happened between us, I had already damaged our friendship. The easy intimacy we had shared was gone, replaced by careful politeness and the awkward dance of two people trying not to acknowledge the elephant in the room. I was choosing fear over possibility, safety over truth, and the cost was becoming unbearable. That night, I finally worked up the courage to leave my room and find him where I knew he would be, sitting on the small balcony off our living room, headphones on, looking out at the city lights that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. He was wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair tousled from running his hands through it, completely absorbed in whatever music was flowing through his headphones. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, gathering my courage, watching the familiar profile of the person who had become the most important part of my daily life. I stepped onto the balcony, the cool night air hitting my face as I approached the small space where Ezra sat with his back against the railing. He looked up when he sensed my presence, pulling off his headphones with a small smile that didn't quite hide the wariness in his eyes. The city sprawled out below us, a carpet of lights that made our problems feel both insignificant and monumentally important. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, my voice rougher than I intended. He gestured to the space beside him without hesitation, shifting slightly to make room on the narrow balcony. I settled next to him, close enough to feel his warmth, but not touching, both of us looking out at the lights instead of at each other. The silence stretched between us, comfortable in the way that only comes from knowing someone well enough to not need constant conversation. But underneath the familiarity was a current of tension, the weight of everything we had said and done and avoided saying since that night when the storm knocked out the power. "I've been thinking," I said finally, the words coming out slower than I intended. "About what happened. About what you said." He waited, patient as always, giving me the space to find my way to whatever truth I was trying to articulate. "I was scared," I continued, staring at the city lights to avoid meeting his eyes. "I'm still scared. Not of you, but of what it means. What I felt when you kissed me, what I've been feeling for months without wanting to admit it." The admission hung in the air between us, and I felt some of the tension I had been carrying in my chest begin to ease. Just speaking the words aloud made them feel less overwhelming, less like a judgment on everything I thought I knew about myself. "I keep thinking about our friendship, about this life we've built together," I said, gesturing toward the apartment behind us, toward the evidence of our shared existence. I was afraid that if we try to make it something more, we might lose what we already have. Ezra shifted beside me, and I finally found the courage to look at him. His expression was gentle but serious, the face of someone who had been thinking about these same questions. "And now?" he asked quietly. "Now I think I was wrong," I said, the words coming easier as I spoke them. "I think I've already been living with the fear of losing you, and it's been making me miserable. I think I've been so focused on protecting what we have that I haven't been able to see what we could have." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine happiness I had seen from him in weeks. "You know," he said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking too. about what I said that night, about not wanting to push you into something you weren't ready for. I waited, sensing that he had more to say. The thing is, he continued, I don't think I was being completely honest. Part of me was being patient and understanding, but part of me was just as scared as you were. Scared that if I pushed too hard, you'd disappear completely. Scared that maybe what I was feeling was bigger than what you were feeling. I reached for his hand then, the gesture feeling both natural and significant. His fingers immediately intertwined with mine, warm and familiar and exactly right. I don't want to go back to how it was, I said, the words coming out in a rush of honesty that surprised us both. I don't want to pretend that nothing happened, or that we're just roommates who happen to get along well. I want to see what this could be, what we could be, if we're both brave enough to try. His smile widened, transforming his entire face with relief and joy. Then don't let it, he said, echoing his own word from that first night when everything changed. We sat there for a long time, hands linked, looking out at the city that had become the backdrop for our transformation. The lights below seemed to pulse with possibility, with all the futures we might build together. Eventually, we made our way back inside, back to the familiar space that now felt charged with new meaning. The living room looked exactly as it always had. The worn couch with its accumulated stains and memories, the coffee table covered in the detritus of our shared life, the television waiting patiently for our attention. But everything had changed in ways both subtle and profound. We settled onto the couch, controllers in hand, falling back into the ritual that had been the foundation of our friendship for so long. But this time, when Ezra leaned against me, it wasn't casual or accidental. This time, when our fingers touched as we reached for the same button, the contact sent electricity through both of us. This time, when I inevitably lost focus and died in the game, it was because I was distracted by the feel of his shoulder pressed against mine, by the warmth of his presence, by the knowledge that this was no longer something I had to hide from. The pizza we ordered grew cold in its box, forgotten on the coffee table, as we discovered that games were no longer the most interesting thing in the room. Our controllers lay abandoned between the couch cushions, our hands finding each other instead, our conversation drifting from strategy and scores to whispered admissions and quiet laughter. The television continued its digital symphony, casting the same blue glow that had illuminated so many of our Friday nights. But we were no longer the same people who had sat in this same space just weeks before, afraid to acknowledge what was growing between us. The world outside continued its relentless motion. Storms would come and go, seasons would change, but here, in the quiet sanctuary of our apartment, I had finally stopped running from the truth of what we had become. The controllers could wait. The games could wait. Everything could wait, because what we had found in each other was worth more than any distraction, more lasting than any routine, more real than anything either of us had dared to hope for.